This is Ujjwal Kashyap and I welcome you at I Desire UPSC. Hello everyone, today we are going to start the 12th chapter of our book India's Struggle for Independence by Bipin Chandra. World War I and Indian Nationalism, the Ghadar. The outbreak of First World War in 1914 gave a new lease of life to the nationalist movement, which had been dormant since the heady days of the Swadeshi movement. The meaning of heady is of alcoholic drink, potent, intoxicating. Britain's difficulty was India's opportunity. This opportunity was seized in different ways and with varying success by the Ghadar revolutionaries based in North America and by Lokmanya Tilak, Annie Besant and their Home Rule League in India. The Ghadarites attempted a violent overthrow of British rule, while the Home Rule Leaguers launched a nationwide agitation for securing Home Rule or Swaraj. The west coast of North America had, since 1904, become home to a steadily increasing number of Punjabi immigrants. Many of these were land hungry peasants from the crowded areas of Punjab, especially the Jalandhar and Hoshiarpur district, in search of some means of survival. Some of them came straight from their villages in Punjab, while others had immigrated earlier to seek employment in various places in the Far East, in the Malay states, and in Fiji. Many among them were ex soldiers whose service in the British Indian Army had taken them to distant lands and made them aware of the opportunities to be had there. Pushed out from their homes by economic hardship and lured by the prospect of building a new and prosperous life for themselves and their kin. They pawned their belongings, mortgaged or sold their land, and set out for the promised lands. The welcome that awaited the travel weary immigrants in Canada and the USA was, however, not what they had expected. Many were refused entry, especially those who came straight from their villages and did not know Western ways and manners. Those who were allowed to stay not only had to face racial contempt but also the brunt of the hostility of white labor force and unions who resented the competition they offered. Agitations against the entry of Indians were launched by Native American laborers, and these were supported by politicians looking for the popular vote. Meanwhile, the Secretary of State for India had his own reasons for urging restrictions on immigration. For one, he believed that the terms of close familiarity of Indians with whites, which would inevitably take place in America, was not good for British prestige. It was by prestige alone that India was held and not by force. Further, he was worried that the immigrants would get contaminated by socialist ideas and that the racial discrimination to which they were bound to be subjected would become the source of nationalist agitation in India. The combined pressure resulted in an ineffective restriction on Indian immigration into Canada in 1908. Tarak Nath Das, an Indian student and one of the first leaders of Indian community in North America to start a paper called Free Hindustan, realized that while the British government was keen on Indians going to Fiji to work as laborers for British planters, it did not want them to go to North America, where they might be infected by ideas of liberty. The discriminatory politics of the host countries soon resulted in a flurry of political activity among Indian nationalists. As early as 1907, Ramnath Puri, a political exile on the west coast, issued a Circular-e-Azadi, Circular of Liberty, in which he also pledged support to the Swadeshi movement. Taraknath Das in Vancouver started the Free Hindustan and adopted a very militant nationalist tone. G.D. Kumar set up a Swadesh Sevak home in Vancouver on the lines of the India House in London and also began to bring out a Gurmukhi paper called Swadesh Sevak, which advocated social reform and also asked Indian troops to rise in revolt against the British. In 1910, Tarak Nath Das and G.D. Kumar, by now forced out of Vancouver, set up the United India House in Seattle in the US, where every Saturday they lectured to a group of 25 Indian laborers. Close links also developed between the United India House group, consisting mainly of radical nationalist students, and the Khalsa Diwan Society, and in 1913 they decided to send a deputation to meet the colonial secretary in London and the viceroy and other officials in India. The colonial secretary in London could not find the time to see them, even though they waited for a whole month. But in India, they succeeded in meeting the viceroy and the lieutenant governor of the Punjab. But more important, their visit became the occasion for a series of public meetings in Lahore, Ludhiana, Ambala, Firozpur, Jalandhar, Amritsar, Lalpur, Gujranwala, Sialkot, and Simla, and they received enthusiastic support from the press and the general public. The result of this sustained agitation, both in Canada and the United States, was the creation of a nationalist consciousness and feeling of solidarity among immigrant Indians. Their inability to get the government of India or the British government to intercede on their behalf regarding immigration restrictions and other disabilities, such as those imposed by the Alien Land Law, which practically prohibited Indians from owning land in the US, led to an impatience and a mood of discontent which blossomed into a revolutionary movement. The first fillip to the revolutionary movement was provided by the visit to Vancouver in early 1913 of Bhagwan Singh, a Sikh priest who had worked in Hong Kong and the Malay state. He openly preached the gospel of violent overthrow of British rule and urged the people to adopt Bande Matram as a revolutionary salute. The meaning of gospel is, is the teaching or revelation of Christ. Bhagwan Singh externed from Canada after a stay of 3 months. The meaning of extern is banish, someone considered politically undesirable from a region or district. The center of revolutionary activity soon shifted to the US, which provided a relatively free political atmosphere. The crucial role was now played by Lala Hardayal, a political exile from India. Hardayal arrived in California in April 1911, taught briefly at Stanford University, and soon immersed himself in political activity. During the summer of 1912, he concentrated mainly on delivering lectures on the anarchist and syndicalist movements to various American groups of intellectuals, radicals, and workers, and did not show much interest in the problems that were agitating the immigrant Indian community. But the bomb attack on Lord Hardinge, the Viceroy of India, in Delhi on 23 December 1912 excited his imagination and roused the dormant Indian revolutionary in him. His faith in the possibility of a revolutionary overthrow of the British regime in India was renewed, and he issued a Yugantar circular praising the attack on the Viceroy. Meanwhile, the Indians on the west coast of the US had been in search of a leader and had even thought of inviting Ajit Singh, who had become famous in the agitation of Punjab in 1907. But Hardayal was already there and after December 1912 showed himself willing to play an active political role. Soon the Hindi Association was set up in Portland in May 1913. At the very first meeting of the association, held in the house of Kansi Ram and attended among others by Bhai Paramanand, Sohan Singh Bakhna and Harnam Singh Tundilata, Hardayal set forth his plan of action. Do not fight the Americans, but use the freedom that is available in the US to fight the British. You will never be treated as equals by the Americans until you are free in your own land. The root cause of Indian poverty and degradation is British rule, and it must be overthrown, not by petitions but by armed revolt. Carry this message to the masses and to the soldiers in the Indian army. Go to India in large numbers and enlist their support. Hardayal's idea found immediate acceptance. A working committee was set up and the decision was taken to start a weekly paper, the Ghadar, for free circulation and to set up a headquarters called Yugantar Ashram in San Francisco. A series of meetings held in different towns and centers, and finally a representatives meeting in Astoria confirmed and approved the decision of the first meeting at Portland. The Ghadar movement had begun. The Ghadar militants immediately began an extensive propaganda campaign. They toured extensively, visiting mills and farms where most of the Punjabi immigrant laborers worked. The Yugantar Ashram became the home and headquarters and refuge of these political workers. On 1 November 1913, the first issue of Ghadar in Urdu was published, and on 9 December, the Gurmukhi edition. The name of the paper left no doubts as to its aim. Ghadar meant revolt, and if any doubt remained, they were to be dispelled by the captions on the masthead. Angrezi Raj ka Dushman, or an enemy of British rule. On the front page of each issue was a feature titled Angrezi Raj ka Kacha Chittha, or an expose of British rule. This chittha consisted of 14 points enumerating the harmful effects of British rule, including the drain of wealth, the low per capita income of Indians, the high land tax, the contrast between the low expenditure on health and the high expenditure on the military, the destruction of Indian arts and industries, the recurrence of famines and plagues that killed millions of Indians, the use of Indian taxpayers' money for wars in Afghanistan, Burma, Egypt, Persia, and China, the British policy of promoting discord in the Indian states to extend their own influence, the discriminatory, lenient treatment given to Englishmen who were guilty of killing Indians or dishonoring Indian women, the policy of helping Christian missionaries with money raised from Hindus and Muslims, the effort to foment discord between Hindus and Muslims, in sum, the entire critique of British rule that had been formulated by the Indian national movement was summarized and presented every week to gather readers. The meaning of foment is instigate or stir up an undesirable or violent sentiment of course of action. The last 2 points of the Chitta suggested the solution. First, the Indian population numbers 7 crores in the Indian states and 24 crores in the British India, while there are only 79,614 officers and soldiers and 38,948 volunteers who are Englishmen. 2. 56 years have lapsed since the revolt of 1857. Now there is an urgent need for a second one. Besides the powerful simplicity of the Chitta, the message was also conveyed by serializing Savarkar's The Indian War of Independence 1857. The Ghadar also contained references to the contributions of Lokmanya Tilak, Sri Aurobindo, V.D. Savarkar, Madam Kama, Syamji Krishna Verma, Ajit Singh, and Sufi Amba Prasad, as well as highlights of the daring deeds of the Anusilan Samiti, the Yugantar Group, and the Russian Secret Society. But perhaps the most powerful impact was made by the poems that appeared in the Ghadar, soon collected and published as Ghadar Di Gunj and distributed free of cost. These poems were marked as much by their secular tone as by their revolutionary zeal, as the following extract demonstrates. Hindu, Sikh, Pathans, and Muslims, pay attention, ye all people in the army. Our country has been plundered by the British. We have to wage a war against them. We do not need Pandits and Qazis. We do not want to get our ship sunk. The time of worship is over now. It is time to take up the sword. The Ghadar was circulated widely among Indians in North America, and within a few months it had reached groups settled in the Philippines, Hong Kong, China, the Malay state, Singapore, Trinidad, the Honduras, and of course India. It evoked an unprecedented response, becoming the subject of lively discussion and debate. The poems it carried were recited at gatherings of Punjabi immigrants and were soon popular everywhere. Unsurprisingly, the Ghadar succeeded in a very brief time in changing the self image of the Punjabi immigrants from that of a loyal soldier of the British Raj to that of a rebel whose only aim was to destroy the British hold on his motherland. The Ghadar consciously made the Punjabi aware of his loyalist past, made him feel ashamed of it, and challenged him to atone for it in the name of his earlier tradition of resistance to oppression. The meaning of atone is make amends or reparations. Why do you disgrace the name of Singhs? How come you have forgotten the majesty of lions? Had the like of Deep Singh been alive today? How would the Singhs have been taunted? People say that Singhs are no wood. Why did you turn the tides during the Delhi mutiny? Cry aloud, let us kill the whites. Why do you sit quiet shamelessly? Let the earth give way so we may drown. To what good were these 30 crores born? The message went home, and ardent young militants began thrusting for action. Hardayal himself was surprised by the intensity of the response. He had, on occasion, spoken in terms of 10 years or some years. When asked how long it would take to organize the revolution in India, but those who read the heady exhortations of the Ghadar were too impatient, and 10 years seemed a long time. Finally, in 1914, three events influenced the course of the Ghadar movement: the arrest and escape of Hardayal, the Komagartha Marti incident, and the outbreak of the First World War. Hardayal was arrested on 25 March 1914 on the stated ground of his anarchist activities, though everybody suspected that the British government had much to do with it. Released on the bail, he used the opportunity to slip out of the country. With that, his active association with the Ghadar movement came to an abrupt end. Meanwhile, in March 1914, the ship Komagata Maru had begun its fateful voyage to Canada. Canada had for some years imposed very strict restrictions on Indian immigration by means of a law that forbade entry to all except those who made a continuous journey from India. This measure had proved effective because there were no shipping lines that offered such a route. But in November 1913, the Canadian Supreme Court allowed entry to 35 Indians who had not made a continuous journey. Encouraged by this judgment, Gurdeep Singh, an Indian contractor living in Singapore, decided to charter a ship and carry to Vancouver Indians who were living in various places in East and Southeast Asia. Carrying a total of 376 Indian passengers, the ship began its journey to Vancouver. Ghadar activists visited the ship at Yokohama in Japan, gave lectures, and distributed literature. The press in Punjab warned of serious consequences if the Indians were not allowed entry into Canada. The press of Canada took a different view, and some newspapers in Vancouver alerted the people to the mounting Oriental invasion. The government of Canada had, meanwhile, plugged the legal loopholes that had resulted in the November Supreme Court judgment. The battle lines were clearly drawn. When the ship arrived in Vancouver, it was not allowed into the port and was cordoned off by the police. To fight for the rights of the passengers, a sore committee was set up under the leadership of Hussain Rahim, Suhanlal Pathak, and Balwant Singh. Funds were raised and protest meetings organized. Rebellion against the British in India was threatened. In the United States, under the leadership of Bhagwan Singh, Barkatullah Ramchandra, and Suhan Singh Bhakna, a powerful campaign was organized, and the people were advised to prepare for rebellion. Soon, the Komagata Maru was forced out of Canadian waters. Before it reached Yokohama, World War I broke out, and the British government passed orders that no passenger will be allowed to disembark anywhere on the way, not even at the places from where they had joined the ship. but only at Calcutta. At every port that the ship touched, it triggered off a wave of resentment and anger among the Indian community and became the occasion for anti-British mobilization. On landing at Buzz Buzz near Calcutta, the harassed and irate passengers, provoked by the hostile attitude of the authorities, resisted the police, and this led to a clash in which 18 passengers were killed and 202 arrested. A few of them succeeded in escaping. The third and most important development that made the Ghadar revolution imminent was the outbreak of the World War I. After all, this was the opportunity they had been told to seize. True, they were not really prepared, but should they now let it just pass by? A special meeting of the leading activists of the Ghadar movement decided that the opportunity must be seized, that it was better to die than to do nothing at all, and that their major weakness, the lack of arms, could be overcome by going to India and winning over the Indian soldiers to their cause. The Elan Jang or proclamation of war of the Ghadar party was issued and circulated widely. Muhammad Barkatullah, Ram Chandra, and Bhagwan Singh organized and addressed a series of public meetings to exhort Indians to go back to India and organize an armed revolt. The meaning of exhort is strongly encourage or urge to do something. Prominent leaders were sent to persuade Indians living in Japan, the Philippines, China, Hong Kong, the Malay Strait, Singapore, and Burma to return home and join the rebels. The more impatient among the Ghadar activists, such as Kartar Singh Sarabha, later hanged by the British in a conspiracy case, and Raghuvar Dayal Gupta immediately left for India. The government of India, fully informed of the Ghadar plans, which were in any case hardly a secret, armed itself with the Ingress into India ordinance and waited for the returning immigrants. On arrival, the immigrants were scrutinized, the safe ones allowed to proceed home, the more dangerous ones arrested, and the less dangerous ones ordered not to leave their home villages. Of course, some of the dangerous ones escaped detection and went to Punjab to foment rebellion. The meaning of foment is instigate or stir up an undesirable or violent sentiments or course of action. Of an estimate 8,000 immigrants who returned to India, 5,000 were allowed to proceed unhindered. Precautionary measures were taken for roughly 1,500 men. Up to February 1915, 189 had been interned and 704 restricted to their villages. Many who came via Colombo and South India succeeded in reaching Punjab without being found out. But Punjab in 1914 was very different from what the Ghadarites had been led to expect. They found the Punjabis were in no mood to join the romantic adventure of the Ghadar. The militants from abroad tried their best. They toured the villages, addressed gatherings at melas and festivals, all to no avail. The chief Khalsa Diwan, proclaiming its loyalty to the sovereign, declared them to be fallen Sikhs and criminals and helped the government to track them down. Frustrated and disillusioned with the attitude of the civilian population, the Ghadarites turned their attention to the army and made a number of naive attempts in November 1914 to get the army units to mutiny. The meaning of naive is of a person or action showing a lack of experience, wisdom, or judgment. But the lack of an organized leadership and central command frustrated all the Ghadar's efforts. Frantically, the Ghadar made an attempt to find a leader. Bengali revolutionaries were contacted and through the efforts of Sachidanand Sanyal and Vishnu Ganesh Pingle, Ras Bihari Bose, the Bengali revolutionary who had become famous by his daring attack on Hardinge, the viceroy, finally arrived in Punjab in mid January 1915 to resume leadership of the revolt. Bose established a semblance of an organization and sent out men to contact army units in different centers, from Bannu in the northwest frontier to Faizabad and Lucknow in the UP, and report back by 11 February 1915. The missionaries returned with optimistic reports, and the date for the mutiny was set first for 21 and then for 19th February. The meaning of semblance is the outward appearance or apparent form of something, especially when the reality is different. But the Criminal Investigation Department (CID) had succeeded in penetrating the organization from the very highest level down, and the government succeeded in taking effective preemptive measures. Most of the leaders were arrested, though Bose escaped. For all practical purposes, the Ghadar movement was crushed. But the government did not stop there. In what was perhaps the most repressive action experienced by the national movement this far, conspiracy trials were held in Punjab and Mandalay. 45 revolutionaries were sentenced to death and over 200 to long term of imprisonment. An entire generation of the nationalist leadership of Punjab was thus politically beheaded. Some Indian revolutionaries who were operating from Berlin and who had links with the Ghadar leader Ramchandra in America continued with German help to make attempts to organize a mutiny among Indian troops stationed abroad. Raja Mahendra Pratap and Barkatullah tried to enlist the help of Amir of Afghanistan and even hopefully set up a provisional government in Kabul. But these and other attempts failed to record any significant success. It appeared that violent opposition to British rule was fated to fail. Should we, therefore, conclude that the Gatherites fought in vain, or that because they could not drive out the British, their movement was a failure? Both these conclusions are not necessarily correct, because the success or failure of a political movement is not always to be measured in terms of its achievement of stated objectives. By that measure, all the major national struggles, whether of 1920 to 22, 1930 to 34, or 1942, would have to be classified as failures, since none of them culminated in Indian independence. But if success and failures are to be measured in terms of the deepening of nationalist consciousness, the evolution and testing of new strategies and methods of struggle, the creation of tradition of resistance, of secularism, of democracy, and of egalitarianism, then the Gatherites certainly contributed their share to the struggle of India's freedom. Ironic though it may seem, it was in the realm of ideology that Ghadar success was the greatest. Through the earlier papers, but most of all through the Ghadar itself, the entire nationalist critic of colonialism, which was the most solid and abiding contribution of the moderate nationalists, was carried in a powerful and simple form. to the mass of Indian immigrants, many of whom were poor workers and agricultural laborers. This huge propaganda effort motivated and educated an entire generation through a majority of the leaders of the Ghadar movement and most of the participants were drawn from among the Sikhs. The ideology that was created and spread through the Ghadar and Ghadar Digunj and other publications was strongly secular in tone. Concern with religion was seen as petty and narrow minded and unworthy of revolutionaries. That this was not mere brave talk is seen by the ease with which leaders belonging to different religions and reasons were accepted by the movement. Lala Hardayal was a Hindu, and so were Ramchandra and many others. Barkatullah was a Muslim, and Ras Bihari Bose a Hindu and a Bengali. But perhaps much more important, the Ghadarites consciously set out to create a secular consciousness among the Punjabis. A good example of this is the way in which the term Turka Sahi, Turkish rule, which in Punjabi was a synonym of oppression and high handed behavior, was sought to be reinterpreted, and the Punjabis were urged to look upon the Turks, read Muslims, as their brothers who fought hard for the country's freedom. Further, the nationalists salute Bande Matram and not any Sikh religious greeting such as Sat Sri Akal was urged upon and adopted as the rallying cry of the Ghadar movement. The Ghadarites sought to give a new meaning to religion as well. They urged that religion lay not in observing the outward form, such as those signified by long hair and kripan showed, but in remaining true to the model of good behavior that was enjoyed by all religious teachings. The ambiguities that remained in the Ghadar ideological discourse, such as those evidenced by Hardayal's advocacy of Khilafat as a religious cause of the Muslims, or when the British policy of not allowing Sikhs to carry arms was criticized, etc., were a product of the transitional stage in the evolution of a secular nationalist ideology that was spanned by the Ghadar movement and its leaders. Also, the defense of religious interest has to be seen as a part of the whole aspect of cultural defense against colonialism and not necessarily as an aspect of communalism or communal ideology and consciousness. Nor did the Ghadrais betray any narrow regional loyalties. Lokmanya Tilak, Rabindo Ghosh, Khudiram Bose, Kanhaiyalal Dutt, Savarkar were all the heroes of the Ghadars. Ras Bihari Bose was importuned and accepted as the leader of the abortive Ghadar revolt in 1915. Far from dwelling on the greatness of Sikhs or the Punjabis, the Ghadars constantly criticized the loyalist role played by the Punjabis during 1857. Similarly, the large Sikh presence in the British Indian Army was not held as proof of the so called martial tradition of the Sikhs as became common later, but was seen as a matter of shame, and Sikh soldiers were asked to revolt against the British. The self image of the Punjabi and especially of the Punjabi Sikh that was created by the Ghadar movement was that of an Indian who had betrayed his motherland in 1857 by siding with the foreigners and who had therefore to make amends to Bharat Mata by fighting for her honor. In the words of Sohanlal Bakhna, who later became a major peasant and communist leader. We were not Sikhs or Punjabis. Our religion was patriotism. Another marked feature of Ghadar ideology was its democratic and egalitarian content. It was clearly stated by the Ghadarites that their objective was the establishment of an independent Republic of India, also deeply influenced as he was by anarchist and syndicalist movements and even by socialist ideas. Hardayal imparted to the movement an egalitarian ideology. Perhaps this facilitated the transformation of many Gatherites into peasant leaders and communists in the 20s and 30s. Hardayal's other major contribution was the creation of truly internationalists outlook among the Ghadar revolutionaries. His lectures and articles were full of references to Irish, Mexican, and Russian revolutionaries. For example, he referred Mexican revolutionaries as Mexican Ghadarites. Ghadar militants were thus distinguished by their secular, egalitarian, democratic, and non chauvinistic internationalist outlook. This does not, however, mean that Ghadar movement did not suffer from any weaknesses. The major weakness of the Ghadar leaders was that they completely underestimated the extent and amount of preparation at every level organizational, ideological, strategic, tactical, financial that was necessary before an attempt at an armed revolt could be organized, taken by the surprise by the outbreak of the war and roused to a fever pitch by the Kumagata Maru episode. They sounded the bugles of war without examining the state of the army. They forgot that to mobilize a few thousand discontented immigrants, Indians who were already in a highly charged emotional state because of the racial discrimination they suffered at the hands of white foreigners was very different from the stupendous task of mobilizing and motivating lakhs of peasants and soldiers in India. They underestimated the strength of the British in India, both their armed and organizational might as well as the ideological foundation of their rule, and led themselves to imagine that all that the masses of India lacked was a call to revolt, which once given would strike a fatal blow to the tottering structure of British rule. The Ghadar movement also failed to generate an effective and sustained leadership that was capable of integrating the various aspects of the movement. Hardayal himself was temperamentally totally unsuited to the role of organizer. He was a propagandist and inspirer, an ideologue. Even his ideas did not form a structured whole but remained a shifting amalgam of various theories that attracted him from time to time. Further, his departure from the US at a critical stage left the compatriots floundering. The meaning of flounder, struggle or stagger clumsily in mud or water. Another major weakness of the movement was its almost non existent organizational structure. The Ghadar movement was sustained more by the enthusiasm of the militants than by their effective organization. These weaknesses of understanding, of leadership, of organization all resulted in what one can only call a tremendous waste of valuable human resources. If we recall, the 40 Gatherites were sentenced to be hanged and over 200 given long term of imprisonment. We can well realize that the particular romantic adventure of 1914 to 15 resulted in the beheading of an entire generation of secular nationalist leadership who could perhaps have, if they had remained politically effective, given an entirely different political complexion to Punjab in the following years. They would certainly have given their strong secular mooring acted as a bulwark against the growth of the communal tendencies that were to raise their heads in latter years. The meaning of mooring is a place where a boat or ship is moored. The meaning of bulwark, a defensive wall. That this is not just wild speculation. It seems from the fact that in the late 20s and 30s, the few surviving Ghadarites helped lay foundation of a secular national and peasant movement in Punjab. If you want to support us in our efforts, kindly subscribe to our channel, like it and share it so that others too gets its benefit. Happy learning. Thank you. Jai Hind, Jai Bharat.